Today marks the second anniversary since my escape from one of the most fucked up cults that you have probably never even heard of. Well, I guess that's how cults work, right? They officially called themselves the Third Reincarnation of the King, or TRK for short. The TRK once lived in the deep wilderness along the northern Nevada-Utah border, where the locals who lived in that area knew better than to mess with them or prevent or hinder their activities. So, the TRK pretty much did whatever they wanted. Let me say this right now. Groups like the TRK are everywhere in the United States. Some are death cults, others are far-right militias, while others are neo-Nazi, doomsday, or end-of-the-world polygamy groups. These days, the FBI, the ATF, and Homeland Security seem to be more focused on radical Islamic terrorist groups in the US. Unless, of course, someone brings a valid reason as to why a group like the TRK should be at the center of their attention. But since no law enforcement agency in America wants another repeat of the Waco tragedy, groups like the TRK pretty much do whatever they want so long as they stay as far away from the public eye as possible and not cause a big disturbance in their actions. In a way, I consider myself luckier than the other children that were brought up into the TRK. I was one of the oldest children in the group when the cult first formed. Most of the families that helped in the establishment of the TRK were once part of a far-right cult called the Church of the Blessed. A power struggle ensued between two of the church elders in this group, which led to a schism. Those who broke away from this group followed Charlie Stock, a self-professed prophet who led his new congregation into the backwoods of northwestern Utah. Members of the TRK quit their jobs and sold all their possessions so that they could give the money to Charlie for him to build a paradise on earth. And at first, life was great. Charlie taught us that he was the third reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and that he would build a paradise on earth for all of us. Under Charlie's direction, we settled on a rather large patch of land in the wilderness near the northern part of the Nevada and Utah border. The compound we built was meant to be entirely self-sufficient. We grew our own food, generated our own electricity, and set up a nice filtration system that would provide fresh water for us from a nearby lake. Everyone, except for Charlie, lived together in several large communal buildings. Only Charlie was allowed to leave the compound, but we didn't mind, since, well, we went on about our daily activities and duties. We all believed that we were living life as God intended for us to do, free from a society corrupted by man. Well, that all changed pretty quickly. That first winter at the compound was incredibly difficult. We all approached life with a God will provide attitude, which really meant Charlie will provide. Our store of food quickly ran out, and all of the livestock was eventually slaughtered and eaten. Charlie soon began making trips to the nearest town to buy food for all 72 of us. He told us that God was testing us, and that only the most devoted would receive nourishment from the hand of God. A packing order soon developed where the most fanatic members of the cult became true believers and received more food. More independent families received less food and were put on prayer lists, and soon became targets during Charlie's daily sermons. Charlie used the prayer lists as a tool to beat the more independent families into submission. In fact, Families who ended up on the prayer lists were eventually broken up and no longer allowed to speak to one another. Furthermore, each member of the family who was broken up had to be monitored at all times by one of Charlie's true believers. My family and I made it onto the prayer list for reasons unknown to me. I mean, we worked hard and participated in all of the activities, but it's more than likely that we just weren't fanatic enough, I guess. And Charlie was out to make an example of us. Winter soon passed and we were able to plant crops again. Charlie bought more livestock for the farm and then declared that money was the work of the devil and that from this point on, we would be completely self-sufficient. But I had my suspicions that most of the money ran out and that Charlie was just making excuses. There likely wasn't that much money to begin with. Most of us in the TRK were lower middle class families and didn't have much to give to the cause even after selling everything that we owned. I think this is when I first started to have my doubts about this whole paradise on earth bullshit that Charlie was feeding us every day during his sermons. But I had to keep my thoughts to myself since me and my family were still on the prayer list. The situation deteriorated further after our crops began to fail and our livestock became ill. We began living on the rice and beans that had been left over from our winter store of food. Charlie responded with 7-hour sermons where he claimed that the devil was among us. He eventually anointed a group of fanatical young men as the King's disciples. They basically became Charlie's henchmen. They got to eat at Charlie's table during supper, and a special building was constructed for them to live in. Soon, all the families in the TRK were forced to work 8-hour shifts in the fields under the close scrutiny of the disciples. But most of the crops died before harvest arrived. I mean, none of us were farmers. We really had no clue what we were doing. And it looked like we would have to weather the incoming winter months on a dwindling supply of rice, beans, and potatoes, since most of the livestock had now been slaughtered and eaten by that point. Looking back, I remember seeing the misery written all over the faces of the more independent families in the TRK that had not yet been beaten into submission. And everything changed for the worse when one of the disciples discovered a family trying to escape the complex under the cover of night. That next day, Charlie announced that he had discovered the root of the devil in our community, and henceforth he decreed that the mother and father were to be stoned to death, while the children would be adopted by one of the more radical families. Charlie instructed all of us to collect stones from the lake, and we all had to watch as the disciples tied up the mother and father to a tree. The disciples then handed out the stones to all the men in the TRK and instructed them to begin stoning the mother and the father. I vaguely remember my own father refusing to do so by throwing his stones to the ground and calling out to Charlie that this was murder. The next few moments are still a bit of a blur to me, as I remember Charlie calling out to his disciples to grab my father and to tie him up with the other two condemned. He then commanded the men of the TRK to begin stoning all three of them, but no one moved, and I had hoped that finally reason would triumph over this insanity. But then the first stone flew and hit the woman in the shoulder. She screamed and cried out to Charlie for mercy, but he only laughed, saying that he could see the devil within the three of them. screamed for everyone else in the compound to kill them before the devil could infect anyone else in our little community. Sure enough, the stones flew freely, and I watched in horror as they connected with my father. One large stone flew and hit him in the face, and I watched him spit blood and broken teeth out of his mouth. My mother cried out and attempted to run to his side, but a disciple picked up a stone and carefully aimed it at my mother. The stone hit her in the temple, and she fell to the ground only a few feet away from my father. Only my father remained conscious throughout the whole debacle, and I can still remember seeing the muscles in his neck bulge as he tried to free himself from his restraints. But Charlie, with a wide smile on his face, walked up to my father with a large rock in his hand. He loudly declared to the whole group that these stones were the tools of God to cast Satan out of our community. He raised the rock high and brought it down upon my father's head with a sickening crunch. Charlie then ordered that the bodies be left where they were, as a reminder that there was no place in this community for the devil. The next night, 2 more families were caught trying to escape. I can still hear their screams and Charlie's maniacal laughter in my nightmares. Charlie now called his disciples his 12 apostles and declared that the rest of us lived in sin. Only Charlie and his apostles were allowed to eat from the winter store of food, whereas the rest of us had to fend for ourselves. Many of the women began sleeping with the apostles so that they could also have access to the food. Everyone else lived on roots, bark, and what little food Charlie handed out after his sermons. 9 people would die of starvation that winter, and 4 more were executed when they were caught stealing food or trying to escape. Only 46 of us were left in the TRK by the beginning of the spring. I guess you could say that Charlie had established his own little fiefdom, complete with his lords and peasants. 34 of us toiled from sunup to sundown, doing whatever task Charlie or the apostles commanded of us. Usually, we spent our time in the fields trying to scratch out a living from the soil. Only Charlie, his apostles, and maybe a few of their wives, and a few other folks, still believed that they were creating a paradise on earth. However, even the apostles' support began to wane when their food supply ran out, and they were forced to eat with the rest of us. Soon, rumors of cannibalism began to spread as the elderly and the weak began to disappear. This was soon confirmed when a young boy spotted 2 of the apostles lead an elderly couple into the apostles' kitchen. They were never seen again, and the faint smell of cooking flesh could be smelled by everyone in the compound if the wind was right. One morning, on my way to fish at the lake, I stumbled upon a secret conversation between 2 of the apostles. I quickly hid from view into some bushes, as I distinctly heard one of them say to the other, "The king plans to end it soon. Says God is calling him and his apostles back to heaven." "What do you mean? And what?" "God is calling us back to heaven. We must answer that call and join the fallen in eternal paradise." You don't really believe in this shit anymore, do you? I'm not gonna die for that crazy asshole. It was good for a while, but look around you, man. Shit has gotten bad. Nah, you know what? Fuck this. You can stay and die if you want, but I'm out of here. A struggle ensued between them, and one of the men was knocked unconscious. The other apostle dragged his body into the lake, where I assumed he drowned later. And once that was done, he set off in the opposite direction from the compound. At that moment, I had to make a decision. Head back to the compound and face certain death, or secretly follow this rogue apostle and hope that he knows how to get back to civilization. It was an easy choice. I had been through too much shit to feel guilty about leaving the others behind to their fate. My parents were dead, and I was not a hero. I was going to get out of this alive, or die trying. I stayed as far behind as possible from my fellow escapee. He seemed to have suffered an injury in his struggle with the other apostle, since he was moving very slowly. By the second day of me following him, his pace had slowed to a crawl, and it was hard for me to stay far enough behind him. Pangs of hunger kept gnawing at my stomach, and my head was pounding from thirst. So I eventually decided to confront the rogue apostle after he had stopped moving completely on the third day. I needed water if I wanted to make it out of this alive, and he was sure to have some. He tried to stand up when I emerged from the bushes, but I put my foot down hard upon his chest. Looking at him more clearly, I saw that he was the same apostle who had thrown the stone that killed my mother. Thoughts of revenge crossed my mind, but I quickly pushed them away instead of embracing them. This guy was going nowhere, since a large gash on the side of his neck looked severely infected. He likely wasn't going to live through the night. I took what little supplies he had and set off again in search of civilization. As I began walking away, I could hear the rogue apostle weakly begging me to not leave him there to die. He kept pleading with me and expressing his regret for killing my mother. But eventually, I made it so far ahead that his screams for mercy were nothing more than a faint echo in the wilderness. Some people might consider me no better than Charlie and his other apostles for leaving the rogue apostle to die out there in the wilderness. But to me, the punishment of him dying alone in the wilderness, with the animals picking at his dead carcass afterwards, was more than enough punishment for the crimes he committed and the suffering he put me through after I saw my mother die by his hands. After several hours of walking, I came across a small country road, and later that night, it led me to a main road where I flagged down a passing car, whose driver promptly drove me to the nearest police station. The first police officer I talked to treated me as a deranged runaway teenager who made up the whole story about the TRK and the compound I had just escaped from. But his commanding officer, a local who had lived in the area his entire life, believed my story immediately. I guess this area that he lived in was popular among crazies and cults trying to live off the grid. The problem was that I could not tell the police exactly where the compound was located. It took several days of aerial searches for them to locate the TRK compound, where they expected to find everyone dead. Instead, they found the bodies of Charlie Stock, his remaining apostles, their wives, and the other TRK members who fanatically followed Charlie, all crucified and burned upon wooden stakes in the center of the compound. According to the police officers who first found them, it looked like something or someone had eaten all the flesh off of their bodies, almost to the bone. The remaining members of the TRK were never found at the complex. The FBI eventually got involved and sealed off the compound as they began their investigation as to where the rest of the TRK members could have gone. Later on, a spokesperson for the FBI announced on the local news stations that the investigators' working theory about what happened was that the remaining TRK members eventually rose up and brutally killed their oppressors. They are now believed to be wandering the wilderness along the borders of Utah, Nevada, Idaho, and Montana, searching for anything edible that they come across. The FBI's new task in their investigation is to, hopefully, along with the local law enforcement from these states, locate and capture the remaining TRK members. It has taken me a long time to get over this difficult period in my life. Even after so many counseling and therapy sessions, I have a feeling that it might take even longer. Fortunately, after spending almost 2 months in protective custody, I will soon be adopted by a loving foster family on the East Coast.